Today, I'm going to talk to you about the research that my group has been doing on deception and on trust, and what the implications are for communities. As you probably all are sort of sensing, the tides of trust are changing quite dramatically right now. And I like to think of trust as not necessarily sort of a thing that increases or decreases, but changes and morphs within society. And there's a substantial amount of changing and morphing taking place, and there's a substantial amount of fear and concern that actually has implications on what trust means for communities. So we're going to talk about trust and deception, and to do that, and since it's getting late in the day and you've been listening to a lot of talks, I want to get you guys to say something for a little bit. So I want you to take 1 minute, and with a partner, somebody in the room that you're with, I want you to come up with your basic idea, your definition of what trust is, okay? So just take 1 minute. I'll give you just 1 minute. Talk with a person or two people beside you, and just come up with something you agree on what trust is, what's important, or what is trust. We all know the word. What does it mean to you, okay? 1 minute, go. First of all, I'm very impressed. Everybody got like right into it. And I was sort of spying and listening in, and nobody was talking about what they ate for breakfast that day or plans later, so you're actually working. Very good. So let's hear. What are some either definitions or important concepts related to trust? So just raise your hand, and we'll get them to shout it out. What are some key things? I don't know how to interpret that, but what about it for you? Mutual understanding. So this idea of not just understanding, but that we do it together and we come to some sort of agreement. Okay, agreement is really important. That's sort of mutual understanding. Good. What else? In the back. Yes, so those are two really important keys there. Expectations are central, this idea of expectation, and trust tends to be future-oriented. Although it's often based on things in the past, sometimes, not always, it's about what's going to happen in the future. So trust is very future-oriented and based on expectations. What else? What else were some concepts? Absence of fear. Okay, so when you're in a trusting space, you have reduced fear. That's a really good point, and we're going to talk a lot about fear today. Yeah. Yes? It takes a long time to build, but it can be destroyed in a very short time. Yes, the Dutch have this great saying, which is that trust walks up to you, but rides away on a horse. And I really like that, right? Because it gets at this idea, and when I talk to companies, typically they're like, hey, the horse has run away. How do we bring it back? And so one of the things to think about is how do you build trust such that when a violation occurs within a community, a company, a relationship, how do you build it so that the horse will come back? And so, for example, in marriages, infidelities are quite common, and it's a core violation of trust. How do you have a marriage that can survive that and turn into something new? This is a big area of research right now. Okay, were there any concepts that we're missing? We've got expectations, we've got mutual understanding, lowered fear. What else? Anything else? Typically one that maybe this is related to the fear is risk. So people are tending to make decisions about like, okay, can I trust this person? Can I trust this company? What about this sort of community or even country? Okay. So now that we have trust down, we're going to do one other, and then I promise we're going to dive into the good stuff. So we have to do one more piece of definitional work. You're going to work with your partners again, and this time I'm going to cold call. Right? I'm going to come after you guys, make sure that you have good concepts, you're talking about things, because we're going to talk about what deception is. And as you now know, I study deception and deception detection. So if you're not talking about deception, I'll find you, I'll know, and I'll embarrass you, okay? So work with your partner. Your job is to come up with what is a definition of deception. And if you're worried about deception, you can talk about lying, which is a little bit simpler. That's a verbal version of deception. But come up with what you would say is the definition for you guys, or important concept of deception, okay? So we've done trust, worked it out. You guys did a really good job. You only missed this risk concept. What about deception? 1 minute, go. What are the key concepts of deception? Perhaps you can beat me to it. I won't have to cold call anybody. Let's see some hands, volunteers, or we'll start cold calling. Volunteer in the back. Intention is one of the core pieces of it. So something, as we'll see, that prevents you from deceiving is if you didn't intend to do that. So if Jason told me that my talk today was at 5 and not at 3:45, and he believed that, then that is a non-deception. That's a mistake, right? So intention is really crucial. Yes, ma'am? Right, okay, so it ties back to trust, where there's been some sort of expectation set up, and if it's intentionally violated, that can be a deception. Very good. Anything else? Yes?
What if it's an unknowing lie?
An unknowing lie, right. So,
You know my background.
yes, so always this is scary for me, yeah. Well, give me an example of something that you're thinking about. Yeah, right. So somebody betrays you, but they don't know that they've done that? Yeah. So there's a class of deception that scares me as a cognitive scientist. This is one of them. The other is self-deception. I avoided it, ignored it for a long time because it's really weird to think about a person could know some truth and then come to believe something that is not true, that's different from that. But it turns out evolution allows both betrayal and self-deception to make sense. Anybody interested can come talk to me afterwards. Yeah. Any other ones? Yes?
It's the other side of the trust.
Distrust, right. So some people actually have argued that distrust is a form of trust, right? So I think this is what you're getting at. So for instance, my wife can sort of like distrust that I'll be a few minutes late to pretty much everything, right? So, right, and so there's some people that have talk about trust as two-dimensional, that there's levels of trust in a person and levels of distrust, and those two things can be independent from each other, right? Cool. So the one last thing that's actually related to this violation of expectation is the creation of a false belief. So this is really important. Whenever you're thinking about, like, was that a deception or a lie or not, it really comes down, if I were to tie everything you guys have said into two things, it's that you intentionally create a false belief in somebody else. That false belief means that you've created somebody to believe something that you know to be false, okay? So we have trust in place, we have lying. Before we get into the updates from the world of fake news and the implications for community, a bit of background. Trust is arguably one of the reasons that we as humans were able to evolve and become so successful. Our ability to cooperate sets us apart from almost every other animal. So trust has been an important part of what it's meant to be a human right from the get-go. And it turns out, as best as we can tell, deception as well. As soon as we evolved the ability to use symbols to talk about things rather than show things, the possibility for deception was introduced. And in fact, some language philosophers, which I don't necessarily agree with, argue that language was created to lie. Right? Others have argued that language was created to cooperate. So we trust over time. Deception's been with us as a human species forever. And trust sort of evolves. In the beginning, it's between people. This is sort of known as dyadic trust. It's very much like a promise. Like, hey, you be nice during my talk, I'll be nice after you, to you later. So it's this dyadic thing. We have a lot of models as humans and machinery to make sure that we know when trust is good, and we can also sense when maybe we're not in a trusting situation. So we're very good at that. But then our community started getting bigger. We started living with networks of people that were too large, and Johan Ugander, who you heard from earlier today, would talk about this notion of like networks become very complex. One of the reasons that our brains grew as much as they did was to track trust with larger networks. And so this is sort of called a network form of trust, where I don't necessarily trust him because I know him, but because he's friends with Jason, let's say. And I trust Jason. But then we get even larger, right? So now we're in villages and cities, and it no longer makes sense because I can't track the whole network. My brain is just not big enough. I can track, a couple hundred people within a network, but after that I can't. And so we start creating institutions. Institutions like the church. Institutions later in our history like the government. Princes, kings, more recently the media. And what we do there is I don't necessarily trust him because I know him. I don't necessarily trust him because he's part of my network. But I trust him because if he doesn't give me the car that I've given him money for, then this other thing that I trust and he trusts will punish him. Okay? So we see this evolution over time. And what a lot of scholars have been thinking about now is, what are the shifts with that kind of trust? And so I don't think that now that we've established trust institution, that goes away. But we see a rise in network trust and a somewhat decline in institutional trust. The Edelman Trust Report, which has been going on for about 25 years, asks people all around the world, different countries, how much can you trust different kinds of entities like institutions. And for the last 10 years, there's been a pretty bad decline in trust institutions like church, government, and very recently, media has really been pounded. And we see at the same time here in Silicon Valley an increase in the trust in networks. Here I'm referring to things like Airbnb, where I allow someone into my home, which is insane from a trusting point of view, and it tends to work out fabulously. The breakage, which refers to the times in which some serious violation of trust takes place, hasn't been officially released for Airbnb, but it's less than 1% of things that take place where insurance claims have to happen. So we're seeing this sort of like morphing and hybridization of institutional trust. So now an institution could be something like Airbnb, which is very unusual. It's a brand. And that brand sits there and says, okay, what's your name again? Nabor. I know Nabor. Nabor and Jeff are going to trust each other, and I'm going to trust him interpersonally somewhat, but this thing called Airbnb is going to take these old forms of institutional trust like insurance and contract law and police, law enforcement, and a financial payment system and put them all together so that when Nabor and Jeff actually finally engage in interaction, there's all this trust that's in place. And the government now is just a bit player in that, still an important player, but this brand is sitting on top of both network trust and this sort of institutional trust. So this is this really exciting time. It's one of those changes in the sort of the way that the tides of trust are working. Now, how about deception? We know a lot less about deception. One of the reasons for that is deception's disappeared for most of our history. So until about 5,000 years ago, no human left any trace of language. So the earliest that we have is very simple writing from about 2500 BC. We start evolving a language somewhere 50,000 to 450,000 years ago. Very hard to actually determine exactly when. But that means there was about 100 billion humans that evolved our biological, cognitive, and social systems that left zero trace. Okay, so 5,000 years is all we have of tracing communication. And we just don't have much evidence, really good evidence, of how much lying takes place, say, on a daily basis, or how many major lies took place by institutions, et cetera. Then we have this explosion of recordability now. So the reason that I have the job I have, the reason that I'm able to do the research I do, is that pretty much everybody leaves a record of their communication. So I could say now to you, for instance, nobody left any writing until 5,000 years ago. Up until 1940, World War II, that's the first time in our world history that more people were literate than not. So that's only, that's like 80 years ago. So right now, if I were to say to you, how many of you have written something down today? Raise your hand. Pretty much every single person here. So this small room of people has written more than all of human prehistory, right? And almost more than all of history, right? Until very, very recently. One of the cool things about that is that we can now actually track lies. And I think this is important for two reasons. One, as a psychologist that studies how lying works, I can see them. I can see what was said. So we study, for example, fake reviews. If somebody writes a fake review, there's a copy of it. When somebody writes a lie as a politician in an email and it gets released, we have a copy of that. So that's one really important thing. We're making huge advances in how lying works. But the other thing is that we're now seeing lies in ways we never have before. And so things like the Panama Papers, the amazing new journalism that's done that's revealing all of these institutions that are lying. So one of my favorites is the Volkswagen scandal from about 5 years ago. You may remember this. They programmed a car to tell when it was being tested by a human. When it was being tested by a human, it would literally lie to that human by changing its engine performance, polluting less while having less power. Then when it sensed that it was not being tested anymore, it would change back to its usual self, pollute more, and have more power. Not one car, millions of cars. Programmed to lie to humans. Now, this came out because of, like almost every scandal of the last 15 years, text message and emails where people said things that they shouldn't have and ultimately find out. If you think of any political scandal from the last 15 years, the letter E usually starts at the beginning, like email, right? Or iMessage, right? So there's usually a vowel that starts all these things. In New York State now, 60% of all divorce cases, the primary form of evidence is email. All of my lawyer friends call email evidence mail, right? And the reason for that is that we now have these records. So what's happening is, one of the reasons that we're having a sense of distrust in the world is we're actually seeing more of the sausage making by the institutions that we used to trust. The Panama Papers are a great example where, because of computation and the ability to copy and share things, journalists from around the world were able to identify where powerful figures and powerful institutions were hiding assets and lying to their countries. So we're seeing these really amazing shifts. I'm an optimist. I'm also a Canadian. Those go together often. So I don't think it's all bad. We're not on a downward trajectory. That said, the last 2 years have been sort of shocking. Okay? Most of you are aware of this thing called fake news that emerged after the 2016 election, and it's become a central concern for our society. Here on campus at Stanford, there's at least a dozen, I'm not exaggerating, groups like mine working on fake news. There has been over $1 billion pledged by research agencies, philanthropies, and tech companies dedicated to research on fake news, right? This is a huge topic. But I have some updates for you from the world of research on fake news. And as you know, us academics, we're a little slower than our industry counterparts. We're about 2 years now after the election and the first concern about fake news. And I would argue we're just now, over the last 3 months, getting real, excellent, and accurate research about how bad fake news was in the 2016 election. Let me share some of the findings from 3 papers that have come out in the last 3 months that I think are really important. The first is that 1% of the population received 80% of all the fake news. What that means is that in this room, this whole group and that group there, if you were to look through all your Twitter feeds, all your Facebook feeds, all your Instagram, you would see no fake news. You were exposed to none. And this group over here got exposed to all of it, right? So this is even a little bit high. It's probably just like these 8 people here. So that's pretty shocking because everybody felt like, oh my God, like I'm getting lied to. Like there's just fake news everywhere. But in fact, it was highly targeted. Who was it targeted at? Has anybody heard about who was being targeted for fake news? Old people. People over 65 that tended to lean conservative. And there's a number of reasons for this. One of them is the way that our media ecosystem is evolving right now, where the right-wing ecosystem is separating itself from the mainstream and left. And so they tended to get targeted with this sort of fake news. And indeed, people tended to be older and conservative. Now, I'd said that 1% was exposed to it. 0.1% of the population, this is focusing on Twitter, 0.1% of the population shared 80% of the fake news on Twitter in 2016. So a very, very tiny part of the Twitter population shared almost all of the fake news. Okay? Third little piece that I think is fascinating and really important. I'd mentioned that the older people were being targeted. The question is, what happened to them? So people over 65 that received fake news were 7 times more likely than someone in their 20s to share that fake news. In fact, that 0.1% that I mentioned was almost all older people, and they leaned conservative. Not all conservative, and not like crazy conservative, like there's crazy liberal and there's crazy, but they tended to lean conservative. Part of it, of course, is because they were being exposed to that. So if we step back and say, okay, well, what's going on here? The first thing is, I think that we experienced a little bit of a moral panic over the last 2 years. What's a moral panic? It's when a society has a conversation with itself about something that it thinks is really, really dangerous and really, really important. And it turns out this isn't even the first time we've had a moral panic about fake news. Some of you may remember yellow journalism around the turn of the last century, where journalists in the US were really focused on like scandal, sex, warmongering, and it was just wholesale made up. Led to major changes in journalistic practices that it led to a golden age of journalism throughout the 20th century. We can go back to the printing press when there was a moral panic about fake news then, where it turned out pretty much anybody, I mean, as far as they were concerned, it was crazy, could print something and put it out. And indeed, there were real documented cases of fake news causing a lot of harm, and then local society is getting really up in arms about that. I think that's what happened here. So what I'm saying is, I think we hit the panic button. I think it was really important, and I'm glad that it happened because we've all had this conversation. There's all these resources dedicated to it. And people, especially older people, are much more aware of the issue. So that's good. The bad part is two, and this is the second big thing I want to talk to you about today. We focused on everybody. And instead, we should have been helping one group really, really hard. And I should also just step back and also say, I don't think it's like fake news is not a problem at all, right? I think it is important. There were 128 million impressions on fake news from the Russian manipulations. So it happened, right? And this is important, and it's crucial that we solve it. But it's not targeting everybody, and not everybody is falling for it. The problem when we hit a moral panic, the panic button with this kind of thing, is for trust. So here I want to introduce the last big concept for today, something called the truth bias. So the truth bias is this. We've been studying deception for about 70 years now. There's been well over 400 studies where Nabur either lies or tells the truth, and then my job is to say, is he lying or telling the truth? Okay? Of those hundreds of studies, thousands of trials, there's only one thing that replicates across all those trials. And it's not where his eyes were. It's not about whether he moved his body a lot. It's not if his voice went high. Any of that. None of those cues that we sort of think is related to lying. Turns out there is no Pinocchio's nose. There is no reliable cue to deception. It's really frustrating for a deception researcher. And for people that are interested in that and maybe have a hard time believing it, happy to talk later. The effect that replicates every single time is something called the truth bias, which is even though I'm in a deception study, and even though I've been asked to say is Nabur lying or not, I am more likely than not to say that he's telling the truth. And in fact, if I don't know what rate he's likely to be lying at, like, oh, it's a 50-50, about 90% of the time I'll say he's telling the truth. And when I say, hey, no, Jeff, like, he's lying 50-50, I'll still say that he's telling the truth about 70-75% of the time. It is a fundamental human phenomenon. It's so important that those people that I talked about, like where did language come from, they argue this truth bias is foundational to language use as humans have evolved it. Right? So we have to believe other people in order for language to work. When we have this kind of fake news dilemma, one of the things that we do is we undermine our sense of trust in each other. And so I think what's important now as we step a little bit back from the fake news moral panic is rethink and say, okay, well, what can we trust? Rather than we can't trust anything. The reason why that's important for communities is when we can trust and build trust within communities, we build all kinds of resilience. It turns out people that are able to trust their neighbors and friends and family more are healthier, they live longer, all kinds of benefits, as you might imagine. But the second is a political one. Distrust in institutions and each other is rule like number one in the authoritarian playbook. When you want to institute an authoritarian sort of regime, you want everybody to distrust everybody else. In that place of a vacuum, the authoritarian comes in as the person that you can always rely on. We see this very much. There's a lot of scholarship right now on Russia and the way Putin has managed the Russian society right now. And it fits that playbook perfectly. The degree to which Americans are willing to undermine themselves by saying we can't trust anything, we can't trust any social media, we can't trust Facebook, we can't trust anything we read online, is playing right into that rule book. So I told you I'm a Canadian and optimist, and I'm going to tell you why I'm still optimistic, and then I think it's time for you to end and have drinks. So to stay optimistic, I have to make sure I get out of the way of that. And that is kids. We've been studying kids a lot. They get a lot of flack for being slackers, for being weird, for digital stuff ruining their minds. I can tell you and assure you that in my view and all the research we've done, we've now finished the biggest meta-analysis ever on well-being. The kids are all right. The kids are better than all right. And we need to learn from the kids. We can go back to that fake news study that showed 65 and older, 7 times more fake news sharing than the young people. It's because they're experiencing media where they are. It's not that they're smarter than us or anything like that. It's just that media is so important to the way they live their lives that they're making decisions all the time, and they need to make good decisions. They're not dumb. They're not narcissistic or any of these terrible terms that other academics just label on generations, which I really can't stand. Instead, what we see with kids when we both go into schools and when we do research on them here is they tend to make decisions about with multiple sources. Whereas for me, it's like, was it in the Times? Did the Stanford Daily say it? Well, maybe that's an iffy. Washington, NPR. I have sources. In their case, their sources tend to be much more multivaried. They come from unusual places. But when they get suspicious about something, they tend to make journalistic type investigations very quickly and using the media that they're in. And so what I want to say is not that, like, let's just leave it to the kids and the old people are terrible, but rather we need to start working together intergenerationally, and rather than blaming each other, like a good community, start trusting one another again. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.